Obviously, money doesn't buy happiness. The only thing money does is give you freedom. That's all, as in, not mental freedom, but, allows you to do what you want to do, really. If you want to go out and do whatever, that's the only thing money can buy, really.
I think mainly the thing we want to do is we want to stay happy, true to ourselves, still want to go out with our mates and chill, and just, as long as we're all right together, then that's fine.
For a couple of months, it seemed that we couldn't get enough of the Spice Girls, but the British press has a wonderful habit of building them up only to knock them down. Pretty soon, somebody got hold of the topless snaps from Geri's modelling days, and they were splashed all over the papers. What's more, she'd also had some nude pictures done, all of which ended up in various top-shelf magazines. And the internet sleaze merchants weren't content either. If they couldn't get their hands on any saucy spice pics, they were content just to splice the girls' heads onto any old naked body and pass it off as evidence of their so-called raunchy beginnings. The internet was also where some serious resentment against the Spice Girls was seen to fester most publicly. Sites with names like Spice Girls Suck and How to Kill the Spice Girls began to spring up, often the product of male American rock fans who hated their airways being polluted with the sound of girls having fun. In Britain, some DJs, most notably Chris Evans, began taking pot shots at the girls, accusing them of having no talent. The writer Oscar Wilde once said that the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about, which makes a lot of sense in the Spice Girls case. The fact that people were so keen to slag them off shows the extent to which the world was taking them seriously. As the old showbiz saying goes, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Then, in early 1997, the Daily Mail found out the truth about the formation of the Spice Girls, and commentators were suddenly up in arms about the way that the early press releases had massaged the real story, as if every up-and-coming pop act hadn't been a little economical with the truth at some time or another. The Spice Girls took all this on the chin, though. Simon Fuller had warned them that there would be a backlash, and they decided the best policy was to be open. Geri especially was quite forthright about her actions, refusing to be embarrassed about anything. To be fair though, sometimes the girls only had themselves to blame. Just before Christmas, The Spectator magazine, a very well established and conservative publication that's much more likely to put an obscure government minister on the cover than some pop group, decided to feature the Spice Girls. Although they never claimed to know anything about politics, the girls chatted to the journalist for an hour, answering all his questions in their trademark uninhibited way. But when The Spectator hit the shops, reactions were less than positive. Both Geri and Victoria had declared themselves to be supporters of the Conservative Party, which was then hugely unpopular. In any case, the pop world had always seen itself as left-wing, especially opposed to the former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who Geri claimed as the original Spice Girl. Serious rock magazines like NME, which had broken their usual indie-only rules to cover the Spice Girls, reacted in shock. Could this be the end of the Spice's love affair with the media? Another activity which offended the rock press was the girls' keenness to add their support for a large fee, presumably, to any commercial venture that was going. Walker's Crisps and Impulse body spray soon became plastered with Spice logos. The production of Spice Girl dolls was seen by some as a cheap way to rip off their fans. They recorded a new version of the old Manfred Mann hit 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 for the launch of Channel 5 television, and made another commercial for Pepsi with a free single in exchange for ring pulls. Again, this was nothing new. Everyone from Elvis and the Beatles onwards had endorsed this or had a tie-in with that. The Spice Girls were just the latest in a long line. But what really hurt was when other musicians joined in with the criticism. Liam and Noel Gallagher of Oasis were the most cut-in, mocking the girls for not playing live and genuinely implying that they were just voiceless shop window dummies, not real bands like Oasis or Blur. Mel C took the opportunity at the Brit Awards to return the challenge, telling the brothers to come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. The Spice Girls could afford to ignore such comments in any case. Pop fans had been putting them at the top of every poll you could think of, culminating in their 2 Brit Awards and a barrel load of other presentations. They were even nominated for the prestigious Mercury Award, usually reserved for much more critically acclaimed serious works, but there was more work to do. For several years, British acts had been facing problems when trying to crack the biggest market of all, the USA. Groups such as Brass, Kylie Minogue and Take That had become firmly established at home but had limited success over the Atlantic. The only big players were the real international megastars, such as George Michael and Elton John, or acts which had made a conscious effort to mould their sound to American tastes, such as Bush and the Cranberries. Oasis and Blur, whose rivalry made the 9 o'clock news in Britain, were seen as cult acts by American audiences. They didn't disappear without trace, but record sales were still disappointing. Most worryingly for the Spice Girls, the American public had turned its back on pop music. Since the demise of New Kids on the Block, there were only 2 ways for an aspiring musician to go in the States: rock, with its big guitars and tortured vocals, and rap, with the massive beats and street-wise rhyming. The Spice Girls' music had elements of rap, but there was no point in passing them off as rivals to Snoop Doggy Dogg. But they had a go anyway. In early 1997, the Spice Girls went to the States, and almost immediately the world turned spicy. After heavy play on the music station MTV, Wannabe went straight into the Billboard charts at number 11, almost unheard of for a practically unknown foreign act. The single quickly rose to number 1, where it stayed for 3 weeks, while the Spice album also reached the top 10. Of course there were critics. Die-hard fans of Pearl Jam and Aerosmith weren't likely to appreciate the effortless fun of girl power, but on the whole, young America welcomed them with an enthusiasm rarely offered to British groups. The managers of the American trio, Hanson, later admitted that they studied the Spice Girls' marketing techniques very closely and used the ideas when plugging the boys' first big hit, Bop. As with the Beatles, the American industry was sitting up, suddenly forced to listen and learn from these uppity Brits. Virgin realised that there was a big potential record-buying public that was being ignored by the American music business. By targeting their efforts at younger fans, as well as a push towards the gay market, which has always had time for feisty, self-assured female singers with a feel for a disco tempo, the Spice Girls had dumbfounded their critics and all those who said they were too British or too poppy for the States yet again. America had fallen to the charms of Zigga Zigga Ha. With the USA conquered, the girls returned to the UK for the release of their 4th single. This was crunch time. Never before had an act hit the top spot with their first 4 records. Virgin took a risk of releasing a double A-side, the sweet sounds of Mama, neatly in time for Mother's Day, contrasting with the upfront disco of Who Do You Think You Are? The risk with double A's is that each side only gets half the airplay it would normally achieve, so casual punters aren't always as familiar with the material. If the Spice Girls were nervous about the gamble, they needn't have been. Who Do You Think You Are became the anthem of 1997's comic relief charity extravaganza, and they swept to number 1 with the advance orders of over 500,000. The only problem was what to do for an encore. Rather like the Beatles, over 30 years before, the Spice Girls' success was as much down to the fact that they were separate, attractive personalities as to the music they produced. They came over just as well in interview as they did when they were performing, each one acting up to a particular characteristic that the fans could identify. The Beatles had turned this to their advantage with a hugely successful film, A Hard Day's Night. So when word got around that the girls were planning a movie, and when a rumour developed that the Beatles director, Richard Lester, was being considered, draws dropped all over the place. Okay, they were successful, but trying to be like the Beatles, they were pushing it too far. As ever, not to be put off by the critics, the girls ploughed ahead with the movie. The reported list of guest stars grew by the day. Elton John, Stephen Fry, Roger Moore, Jules Holland, Barry Humphries, Meat Loaf. Whatever this movie was going to turn out like, low-key wasn't the word. But while this was going on, all was not well in the Spice camp. Just as they'd been frustrated at the management offered by the Murphy-Herbert team, relations with Simon Fuller, the man who'd masterminded their rise to the top, were souring. It might never really come out what happened between them, but before the release of The Spice World, the movie, Fuller was fired as manager. There was a little sniping between the two sides, but most pop fans don't even know what a manager does and care less. But again, the critics had their knives out. What were the girls doing? How could they survive without Fuller's guiding hand? Surely this was a sign that girl power was nothing but an empty slogan. Where would they go without the assistance of a strong man? They needn't have worried. The Spice Girls were perfectly able to take care of themselves. And now they had a movie, complete with an accompanying album to complete. The first release from Spice World, the Latin-flavoured Spice Up Your Life, was a controversial choice with very silly lyrics about a yellow man in Timbuktu, but it still went straight in at number 1. But the big test was still ahead. What would the punters make of the movie? Pop stars and films have always been a dodgy mix. Apart from the Beatles and Elvis in the early days, pop movies have usually been seen as evidence of a huge ego, and most singers turned actors realise they ought to stick to what they know best. Stars like Mick Jagger, David Bowie and Bob Dylan have never been in the running for the Best Actor Oscar, and acts from Slade to the Pet Shop Boys have seen their cinematic efforts ripped to shreds by movie and music critics alike. But as has so often been the case, the critics were pleasantly surprised. Okay, Spice World, the movie, will never go down in history as a classic of the cinema, but it was a fun romp, full of in-jokes, dance routines, guest appearances, and of course all the hit tunes and more. The girls didn't bother to act, they just played themselves in a silly plot about an Albert Hall gig that only comes off at the last minute. It was the Spice's life, as all the fans believed it to be, or at least wanted to believe it. Geri came over as bossy and opinionated. Victoria was obsessed with clothes, especially her beloved Gucci, and the others all fitted into their appropriate roles. Possibly the best moment was when the girls dressed up as their childhood heroes and heroines, from Charlie's Angels to Wonder Woman and Elvis Presley. They also managed to slip in some pretty convincing impressions of each other. Oddly, although the script was written before the girls fell out with Simon Fuller, the plot was actually about a fictional manager played by Richard E. Grant, who behaves like a control freak but can't tame the irrepressible Spices. The coincidence was especially odd because the screenplay was written by Kim Fuller, Simon's brother. It was unpretentious, it was cheerful, and the fans loved it. And even if most of them were too young to know, it was a little bit like A Hard Day's Night. In fact, the only thing that stopped it from being a bigger success in British cinemas was the release shortly after of a movie called Titanic. But the girls had succeeded where so many others had suffered extreme embarrassment. They transferred their lives onto the big screen. Although the Spice Girls appear to have conquered most of the known world, there were still whispering campaigns that they were on their way out. At the Brit Awards in February 1998, All Saints took 3 awards to the Spices 1. It looked for a moment as if the originals were past their sell-by date, but this really demonstrated how the Spice philosophy had come to dominate the pop landscape. Different as they are, All Saints, not to mention Bewitched, Cleopatra, Vanilla and many other girl groups must have had some level of encouragement from the Spice Girls' success. One way they managed to answer their critics was by establishing themselves firmly as a live act. After shaky beginnings at a Pepsi-sponsored gig in Turkey, they began touring all over the world, with tickets for their New York shows selling out in a record 12 minutes. After they played at Wembley, Chris Evans, previously one of their fiercest critics, made a public apology and devoted a whole episode of his show, TFI Friday, to the girls. They were also invited to perform alongside Ian McCulloch, Ocean Colour Scene and Space in the official song for England's World Cup bid in France, '98. Not only was it yet more public exposure for the girls, but it was another step to show that females could progress in areas that, only a few years ago, were boys only. Some still weren't convinced. The legendary American producer Phil Spector created a furor by describing the Spice Girls as the Antichrist at the Q Awards at the end of 1997, conveniently forgetting that he had been responsible for several similar girl groups during the 1960s. But in any case, the vast majority of Spice fans would just shrug and ask, Phil who? But trouble was brewing in the Spice camp. Fans had become used to rumours that one or other of the girls was planning a solo career, whether it was Emma being set up as a rival to Louise, or Mel C being groomed as a new indie pop star, a sort of female Robbie Williams. So, at the end of May '98, when Geri was absent for a performance on the National Lottery show and a couple of gigs in Norway, most people accepted the official explanation that she had a stomach bug. But it was more serious. As rumours developed, a band spokeswoman was forced to admit that nobody knew where Geri was. It turned out that she had visited the girls' new ally, Chris Evans, for advice on a change of career, and then slipped away to Spain to avoid the press. On May 31st, the official statements finally came. Geri was out. As usual, the reason for the decision was put down to differences with the other members, but nobody wanted to explain what these were. There were some hints of hope for the distraught fans, however, as the four remaining Spices ended their message with the familiar "friendship never ends," and Geri bravely declared, "P.S. I'll be back." Immediately, the Vultures were back, announcing that this was the end of the Spice dream, pointing out that Take That had only staggered on for another few months after Robbie left. But the girls were too busy to worry about the sniping. They were gearing up for their first concert tour of the USA. Gradually, a few facts began to appear from the explosion of rumours. Although all the girls had supported the decision to sack Simon Fuller as manager, Geri had been the main ringleader, and there was a feeling that she was aiming to take control of the band for herself. The others, especially Mel B, resented this deeply. Also, Geri had always been keen on the idea of a TV career separate from the Spice Girls, and she realised that she'd probably have trouble combining the two. Once the dust had settled, it appeared that the band was pretty much intact, and the reaction of the fans at their first US gig in Florida seemed to support this. They missed Geri, but they still supported the Spice philosophy, and they'd still keep backing the remaining girls. Work was continuing on the third album with the unlikely help of hip-hop superstar Missy Misdemeanor. But there must have been a few tears when the video for the new single from Spice World, Viva Forever, was shown towards the end of June. The girls were represented as cartoon fairies in a summer meadow scene, and there was Geri still hanging out with her old friends. The only problem facing the Spice Girls now was that they didn't have anything left to prove. As much as critics complained, they demonstrated an ability to hold their own in a completely fickle market. What can they do next? And if the worst comes to the worst and they're on their way out, what effect have they had on our lives? Although they were written off at first as just a pop act not to be taken seriously, some pretty important people have realised the benefit of being seen with the Spice Girls. The young princes, William and Harry, are fans, and their dad, Prince Charles, was very publicly smothered with lipstick by them at an official function. World leaders like Nelson Mandela are happy to pose with them, and British Prime Minister Tony Blair has said that the success of acts like the Spice Girls is part of his vision of Cool Britannia, a way to present the new, lively, popular face of Britain to the world. The girls still seem to be a highly profitable area for the tabloids. Victoria's relationship with David Beckham has had acres of coverage, and the rumour machine has linked Mel C with footballer Jason McAteer and even Robbie Williams. Mel B's love life also came under scrutiny as stories of her engagement came out, although these just had to be accompanied by pictures of her frolicking topless in the sea. Hardly a day seems to go by without the Sun or the Mirror announcing that one of the girls is pregnant or that another is about to leave for a solo career. None of these seem to be based on anything more than the flimsiest rumour, but it proves that the public is desperate to lap up anything, however ludicrous, that relates to the Spice phenomenon. They'd become completely established as a British way of life for the number of people trying to copy them. Dozens of cover bands tour around the country, performing all the hits, with dance routines copied from the videos. But when the real girls finally got round to touring the UK in 1998, punters had a chance to see that, as the song goes, there ain't nothing like the real thing. The exit of Geri left some question marks hanging over the future of the Spice Girls, and they must have considered what to do when eventually the girls split for good. There are horror stories about 80s bands such as Wham and Bros, who despite huge record sales never got the money they deserved. The Spice Girls are too clued up to fall into this trap. If they retired from performing tomorrow, royalties would ensure that they would each live very nicely. Each girl has her own production company, and they'd easily be able to run solo careers alongside their group work if they wished. Having smashed just about every chart record there is, simply carrying on churning out chart-topping hit after hit would probably get a bit dull, and that's something you'd never accuse the Spice Girls of.
Stop press at around 6:55 p.m. on Sunday, July the 26th, 1998. It was announced that Viva Forever, the Spice Girls' 8th single, had hit the number 1 spot in the singles chart. It had sold 250,000 copies in 6 days and was their first release since Geri's departure. Confounding their critics who'd said that their days were numbered after Geri left the band, this has clearly proved that Spice is here for a long time yet. Thank you for buying Maximum Spice, we hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further releases on Chrome Dreams from All Saints, Madonna, Boyzone and many others over the next few months. If you did enjoy it or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, KT3 6YY and tell us so. We've got 3 copies of our next release for the best letters, so don't forget to include your name and address. Thanks again for listening and goodbye for now.